When we're standardized, kids that have our attention, because there's somewhere within this kind of pathway of thinking about acting out in a violent way, we intervene in order to turn them off that pathway. We're not trying to arrest them. We're not trying to kick them out of schools. When they end up in a school where people pump the brakes and treat them differently, that's actually a trigger for them to get worse. So I believe by not having it standardized, you're most definitely increasing your risk.
Welcome to the BTAM Breakdown. I'm Jason Matlock, and today we're tackling a critical challenge in school safety: creating standardized behavioral threat assessment protocols across multiple schools. So if you're a superintendent, director of safety, director of mental health services, anyone that's really involved, this will help you talk about how districts often struggle with inconsistencies, resistance to change, and adapting the BTAM process to fit different environments. I have a co-host, Dr. Julia, with us today.
Hi, Jason. Happy to be here again with you.
Thank you. And we'll talk more about, your what's going on with you in the world. And we also are going to bring in two wonderful folks. I'll let them do a little bit of their own bios because I never like doing full bios. But we have John Van Dreal, who is one of the original authors of the Salem-Kaiser Cascade model out on the West Coast, and Dr. Jessica Weller out of Delaware, who has what I found out of a somewhat similar career as mine, but obviously, as I've said before, she worked a lot harder and got that doctor in front of her name where I never went that far. So I think she probably knows even more than I do at this point. So we're going to bring them in and have a great time today talking about how we're going to help you folks with that standardization across districts. Welcome, friends. How are you all today?
Good.
Excellent. So on that note, if you would be so kind as to just, John, start us off with just a little bit about you and what your world's about in the threat assessment.
All right. Thanks for having me participate in this. It's an honor to hang out with all of you and talk about topics I think are extraordinarily important. I'll just do a quick kind of background on how I got to the point in my career that I'm at now. When I started my college career, I started in fine art and became a professional painter and writer. But I also wanted to have a family, and while that can be a rewarding career and one can make a living, it's very much a roller coaster. So luckily I had a minor in psychology, so I went back and got 2 advanced degrees in school psych and ed psych, so that I could be at least some sort of a mental health practitioner, whether it was in the schools or not. But where I landed was in an institutional setting with residential care, students and kids, actually adults as well, acute care facility and residential. And a lot of them were extremely angry, some of them aggressive and some of them violently aggressive. And so I guess I got my chops working with them, and I actually enjoyed it quite a bit, learning to de-escalate people and figure out what was leading them down that pathway to some fairly dangerous behavior, suicidal ideation, fire setting, and sexual misconduct, all thrown into that. And so after a couple of years of that, I decided to look into education. My parents were educators, and with that resume, in Oregon especially, they just didn't have a lot of school psychologists that were willing to work with those kids. And so it was an easy road out and lots of jobs. And so I did end up in Salem-Kaiser, which is a school district in the capital of Salem, or Oregon. It's the second largest school district. So it was a pretty good size group of kids, about 42,000. And as a school psychologist, I was assigned to work with teachers and parents and kids that were highly combative, or basically in the district, the kids that people would say that were the worst. Now, I didn't agree with that language, but they were certainly they had the greatest impact on classrooms. One of the things that I noticed was that when students were aggressive or when they were threatening violence, I noticed the impact that had on learning. I noticed the impact it had on teaching, on administering, on counseling, on driving buses, on providing food in the cafeteria. Everyone's brain shuts down, kind of moves to a fight or flight, and the whole business of educating and teaching comes to a standstill. So that became a very important interest of mine as a school psychologist, as an educator, is how can I take that temperature in a classroom and in a school and in a culture, a city and a district? How can I take that down several degrees so people can get to the business of using, their forebrain cognitively to process information and use reason and learn how to do algebra? As that evolved, these school shootings started to happen in the 90s. And my school district looked around in 1998, 99, and decided that they would volunteer me to figure that one out. And I am, by obviously, the senior member of this group in age. And so I don't know how far you all go back, but the research in the 90s was basically suggesting that kids who light fires, hurt animals, and wet the bed were your greatest risks. And they are for reactive aggression. But for targeted violent mass shootings or gang-related targeted shootings, that doesn't equate. And so luckily, I was able to attach myself to the Safe School Initiative and some of the FBI work. And early on, right around 99, I started drawing information from their studies. And by 2000, I had an early version of what they were suggesting would happen. It should happen in the schools. And I just took their risk factors and I systematized them into a model now called the Salem-Kaiser Cascade model. It's been called a lot of things. And it's a comprehensive violence prevention, emphasize the word prevention, behavioral threat assessment model that has evolved now for 26 years through focus groups. And not only in our region, we regionalized it in Oregon and Washington. All the districts, almost all the districts are using it. But as it's evolved, I've been fortunate enough to work with lots of school districts and get their feedback. So I've refined that system and my own skill set based upon the information that comes from practitioners. Having been a practitioner in the field and, been right in there with the kids and taking the punches, I felt like I needed to continue doing that and learn that information. So I think I get as much from these kinds of episodes like webinars and podcasts and trainings as I deliver, because I learn, and that affects how I refine the system I work within. And then I advise on lots of other systems like CSTAG and NTAC and other districts that are using those systems. I help them out because we're all based on the same basic construct. And then I retired in 2019 and as the director of security, risk management, emergency management, and threat assessment for Salem-Kaiser, and decided to have my own consulting business. And I'm here as the principal of John Van Dreal Consulting.
Thank you. And don't let the baby face fool you. I'm not that far behind you. I do remember some of those early days and some of the early things that we learned around there and that. And talking about practitioners, and again, it's funny when we do these, you can tell by the background who's got the cushy life working from home and who's actually doing the work still. Dr. Jessica Welder is here with us, and by the fact that she's still got a calendar that she's got to pay attention to and a phone she's got to answer will tell you that she's doing some real work. Dr. Welder, welcome. Welcome from Delaware. Give us a little bit about you and about your why and your journey. I teased it in the intro that you and I actually have some similarities in our background, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jessica Weller. I am currently the supervisor of school climate and safety for the Milford School District in Milford, Delaware. We are a smaller public school district out of 19 in Delaware, and I am in charge of all of the safety here, security, and discipline, school climate, and culture. So lots of things fall under me. My previous area of employment was law enforcement. So in 2019, I was given the opportunity to move into the education industry, and I jumped on that. But prior to that, I was a police officer for 12 years in 2 different municipalities in Delaware. And during that time, I was a school resource officer for a total of 7 school years in those 2 different municipalities. In one of them, I was able to kind of get the SRO job going for that police department and school district for their middle school. And then I covered K through 8 in the other district I worked in for 6 years. So lots of experience on the criminal side of things and seeing how, without having a behavioral threat assessment process and model to use, things can get really messy very quick and sometimes very long, drawn out, but they can be messy in the end. I went, when I was an SRO in my prior school district, we started this CSTAG model. It was the Virginia model at the time. I think it was 2017. And we used that up until I left. We worked with PCG with that model in the state of Delaware and their partnership, which I'm sure we'll get into during this conversation. And then when I came to the Milford School District, we weren't using any behavioral threat assessment model. So I was able to bring it on board here and introduce it. And this is our first year fully implementing and immersing, and it's going really well. So I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you both again. And Dr. Julia, just refresh folks on your basic background, if you would.
Sure thing. I'm Dr. Julia Hollinger. I am a licensed clinical psychologist, a licensed school psychologist. I've been in practice for 17 years. I'm still a practicing psychologist and school psychologist, but my full-time gig is with on the BTAM team with PCG, and I do have expertise in behavioral threat assessment and particularly in suicide risk assessment. I am a certified school suicide prevention specialist. So lots of experience there, and just very excited to talk to Dr. Weller and John today about standardization.
Awesome. And let's get into that. And first, like I said, it's almost creepy, Dr. Weller. I mean, that was the fact that I 12 years, 2 different departments. I was more thrown into the SRO role. It was one of those I was voluntold. But yeah, it was like it just blows my mind sometimes how things can work out for folks.
No, I was voluntold too, Jason. But
okay.
I really, when I started, I thought I was going to be like this SWAT team member that got to poke my head through attics, and I ended up the community policing and SRO officer. So
we definitely have to talk more, because I literally was on the regional team, and I'm like, I'm loving life, living the dream, and all of a sudden they're like, yeah, you're going in the schools. And then 6 years later, I was like, no, I'm never leaving schools. So yeah. I love it. Let's talk about that inconsistency. So we're talking about standardization. I mean, we work in education. Education has a lot of folks who are still trying to figure it out. Let's all be honest. If we knew exactly how to educate kids in K-12, we'd be doing it. And we have a lot of struggles. Test scores say it, disparities in discipline say it. So just being transparent. But why standardize? Why not let everybody do whatever the heck they want, because they might know best because they're closest to it? And I'll start with you, Dr. Weller. Why is standardization important?
So standardization is important specifically for one school district, because we obviously have different schools in a district. For most of the school districts, I know some districts have one building and serve K-12, but for the most part, I mean, John's talking about Salem Kaiser. I think earlier he said 42,000 students. I have 4,500, so it's a lot smaller. We do have larger districts in Delaware, but when you think about from a district lens, you really want to have that standardization so you don't have schools offering different interventions and different tools for de-escalation and conflict resolution is really how I see the BTAM process. If we have one school doing it and not another, then the students aren't receiving the same services from the district. And then from a statewide lens, it is very helpful to have a standardization, like a standard across the state, because what we've found, students are going to go to different districts. They are going to be able to, depending on why, it could be a discipline lens, it could be transient family, it could be all sorts of things. Um, but they're going to switch different districts. So if we have a standard, then we are able to track those students as well as staff who most states are, you get a certification from the state. So if we have employees that I shouldn't say jump around. If we have employees that change districts, I have an amazing counselor right now who left a district who was using the CSTAG model and the PCG dashboard. So it was very helpful for me because I didn't have to put a lot of training into her. She was ready to go. She had already knew the system and knew the model before she got here.
Good. And you touched a little bit about it. And I know, John, you've got some folks that are that working with you that are out on the West Coast looking at those interventions too. So talk about consistency across larger spans, and then not only in the assessment process, but why is it important to have some of these things standardized when you're talking about your interventions as well?
I appreciate very much what Dr. Weller was saying about standardizing within schools. So if I could just piggyback off that and then jump to the kind of the large picture of regionalized standardization, but just from within a district's perspective, one of your risk managers and your attorneys will tell you that it decreases liability. And the people who write the checks for lawsuits will be excited about that standardization. I am as well, but it also truly increases safety and protective measures for kids, and that includes the student of concern. So when we're standardized, kids that have our attention, because they're somewhere within this kind of pathway of thinking about acting out in a violent way, we intervene in order to turn them off that pathway. We're not trying to arrest them. We're not trying to kick them out of schools. And so if we have a standardized process that does that throughout all of our schools, regardless of where they move, they're treated the same. And what happens if you don't do that? If you have a school that's far more punitive in their model because you have a strong local control model like Oregon does, and that student moves or is transferred, that student's going to get treated in a punitive manner. And what that will do to any kid that's kind of in the pathway, that 5% of kids that don't really respond to behavioral modification and positive stuff, they've already checked out. They're already disinterested in anything we have to offer. When they end up in a school where people pump the brakes and treat them differently, that's actually a trigger for them to get worse. So I believe by not having it standardized, you're most definitely increasing your risk, depending on where those kids go. Because that's anecdotal, but I know the data supports that. That's one. The second reason is if people do it a different way, when information from one school or school district goes to another school district or school, that information can cause alarm with the new school because they don't understand the language or the system. It may be a totally viable, excellent system, but it doesn't match their construct. And the way our brains work is pretty simple. Anything that's familiar, we're very quick to observe and orient and move to a decision. Milliseconds, if it's familiar. If it's novel, we have to stop. We observe and re-observe, and then we orient to it. We try to make sense. What does this mean? What's this word mean? Is this the same word as we have in our system? And if you have to do that, if it pauses the brain, it causes discomfort. And in a world of education where counselors and principals, SROs are doing 1,000 things, they wear tons of hats, the last thing they need is something that causes them a half hour's more work while they figure it out. First of all, that's taxing to them, the best employees. Those that are not strong in their position just won't do it. Or worse, they're going to look at that kid, this new kid in their school, and they're going to pump the brakes, possibly exclude that kid become reactionary, maybe kind of overdo the safety plan. And again, we get to that trigger where that student now is angry. I had this thing, people were checking in with me. I had a mentor at my previous school, and now you all are restricting me to the office for the next 3 months. And it can cause that trigger. Those same principles and arguments exist when we regionalize, because in most places, kids move from school to school and district to district. In Oregon, there's lots of movement up and down the I-5 corridor all the way into Washington. In Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon, kids bounce around between school districts. And so continuity, consistency, and standardization have really served the two states as they've moved forward, both with Department of Ed encouragement, soft mandates.
I'm going to give you all a minute to think about this one as I pitch out my own thought on it. So I want you to think, and I'm going to start with you, Dr. Julia, about a specific case, if you have any, where you saw this inconsistency show itself. So, a lot of times when I talk about threat assessment, I talk about the assessments are great and no, no diminishing, John, what you've created or what Dr. Cornell created or what the NTEC model is out there. But the assessment is so much only a small part of the process. The plan to support that student, as we've been talking about, what are the things that keep them off that pathway after you make your assessment, is key. And to me, I have a story that I've talked about before, where we had a fifth grader whose parents thought, when he said he wanted to buy a ghillie suit, and for those who don't know what a ghillie suit is, it's the standard garb of a military sniper, so they can hide in the trees and bushes and be customized. They thought, sure, we'll buy you a ghillie suit for your fifth grade birthday. And then he proceeded to get up on the roof of his school. Now, no weapon, no nothing, no writings or intent leakage, anything like that. But obviously, you could imagine it caused a little bit of alarm. And so we worked on that assessment. We supported that student for years. And things were going smooth until, of course, the transition to high school, because the two schools, the K-5 and the middle, were on the same ground. So they were like a campus model. So they knew each other. But then when it was the launch to the high school, they lost continuity even within the district of what was going on. And of course, things immediately popped off. So for me, that was one of my first red flags of, I've really got to get them all in the same system and pushing them. If you've all got a moment to think of something that is, you've seen this happen, I want to give folks that idea that it happens everywhere. It's okay. We're not blaming or shaming when we talk about these things. We have folks to learn from them. And don't all raise your hand at once.
Yeah, so I want to hear, because I think Dr. Weller alluded to this earlier when she was doing her intro. And like her, I come from practicing in really tiny districts, and I feel like the inconsistencies and non-standardization stand out even more when you only have, 3,000, 3,500, 4,500 students and a limited number of schools. And I know I saw a lot of that when I was practicing. Jason, to your point, it seems like that cutoff is high school. So elementary schools kind of tend to be a little bit more, lenient and put support plans in place. And then they get to the secondary level and, all of a sudden now this kid is on everyone's radar, whereas before he was being pretty well supported, he or she. But yeah, I definitely saw the impacts of that. And even in between elementary schools. So some of the districts that I practiced in would have several elementary schools that fed into one middle, one high school. And even across elementary schools, different principals have different ideas of how things should be handled. And, a child that maybe not on anyone's radar, able to be managed without formalized supports in one elementary school would not have the same experience in another elementary school. And so in two of the districts that I practiced in, where I started behavioral threat assessment protocols, this was back before we had anything like PCG, or I mean, we were just doing things pencil, paper, and I was going based on what I thought was best practice. But, just trying to get everyone on the same page there. But Dr. Well, I'm wondering whether that was your experience as well, too, in those tinier districts.
For sure. I think that in the smaller areas, my my district right now, I have 3 elementary schools, a kindergarten center, a middle school, and a high school. So if a family has a child in our middle school and high school and they're being treated differently, it is very obvious. And when you are in the smaller communities, and I'm sure, John, you experience this where you are as well, but they talk at the little league fields and the football games, and they talk about the things that their kids have been through. And if one school is doing it differently than another school, it is really difficult to explain that from an equity lens from the district office. Um, I won't go into too many details because it is a relatively fresh situation, but I do have a situation. Like I said, this is the first year we've implemented the behavioral threat assessment process in the district I'm in now, and we have a student who has risen to the level of discipline referrals, we'll say it that way, multiple times over the past 4 years, 5 years. I mean, just ongoing statements of like threatening statements, things that are very concerning. So this year we were able to go through the entire BTAM process. I think the one thing that the process does, to your point, Jason, it's not just about getting the answers of the in the moment. It's let's talk about what we're going to do for you and how we're going to support you. And then when you do bring the parent in and you do bring outside people in and you put them through the interview process, it's a reality check. It becomes a real serious thing for them. So they start to realize, like, oh, you want to send the police to my house to search my child's room? Like, okay, I really need to get involved. Let me sign that permission to evaluate. Let me sign that third party counseling form. Like, here you go. How do I get out of this office quicker? Um, and it also, for that student who hasn't had attention, whether it's negative or positive in the moment, but that attention and that support. I ate cupcakes with that student the day before winter break, and him and I were talking about how excited we were to have the break off. Like, he's a totally different kid because we were able to get him counseling. We were able to give him the interventions that he needs to process through. And he is just wonderful. I mean, it's really crazy the difference in a 4 month window from October till now that you can have a conversation with him and he can talk about how he feels. Just from that quick. Now, obviously, something could change long term, but we're working on that. And as long as he stays in the districts in Delaware that are using this model, he's not going to, they'll see what we have, they'll see his plans, it'll transfer with him. So it's pretty beneficial from that lens.
That's such a great example of how we can, by using a standardized protocol, really change the course of a student's life and
Yeah, the
kind of get
trajectory
them
for
off
sure.
that pathway. Yeah.
And I love the fact that it also illustrates that our traditional way of doing things, and this is maybe where, and John, I'll let you jump in with a story, but I also want to, at some point, we got to start talking about people want to do it their own way. But by doing it their own way, this kid was just going to go through this cycle of getting referred. But by being stopped and being forced to go through what, again, people have wrongly labeled as a scary process, now we've been able to put a kid on a pathway. That's awesome. John, I mean, when it comes to that, stories or ideas around this idea of some call it autonomy bias or some kind of this concept of pushing back and wanting to do it their own way.
Yes, excuse me. The example I gave earlier about students getting set up to fail if they're on supportive, inclusive supervision plans from one school, and those plans either get dropped or they get changed to a highly restrictive punitive plan. Those are both setups. And again, we're not talking about kids in large part who respond to the typical interventions, behavior modifications that we do for kids. These kids come to us uh, poorly socialized for the most part, and we have to grow them up and help their parents and turn them into good citizens. That takes time. And so there's just, we just have to expect a certain amount of rowdiness. But this kind of 5 or 10% of the kids that really feel disenfranchised and they're excluded for the most part, they don't fit into any social paradigm. They're at risk for a lot of things. And so continuity in any program that addresses that population is super important. I'll give you an example, though, of the opposite of this, where it wasn't about an overreactive situation. The Mid-Valley Student Threat Assessment Team, which it was started by Salem Kaiser, but includes 3 counties and 19 other school districts that range from 300 kids to about 4,000 kids. That team has been in existence for 25 years. And with a big district like Salem Kaiser, you get this mandate. And when we first started, we had a few principals that were like, we're very much a local control state, but most districts have changed that rule when it comes to safety and security. They basically said, all schools in this district, these are our policies, these are our practices, this is our quality assurance model. You will do this. That's great. You can do that in a district where you have a boss and lieutenants, so to speak, assistant soups. But what's harder to do is when you try to regionalize that. And so as we built this team, we had one city that the other 19 schools were through the Education Service District, by the way, which is the equivalent of an ISD or a BOCHI or something like that in the rest of the country. It's a service district. It provides services to smaller districts who can't afford a full-time school psychologist. So they split the FTE. And so we exported to those school districts. We had one district about 3 years in who it wasn't very expensive for them to buy in, but they just decided that they would do it their own way. And they're very much a local control district, North County, and that they were just going to just go with law enforcement. Law enforcement would figure this out, and they couldn't figure it out. They could just refer to the mental health people in the community. By the way, the mental health people in the community did not like that idea at all. They were really digging this multi-agency, multidisciplinary group think and solving problems. Everybody loves to share their liability, right? We stand together or we hang alone. And so they opted out. This district opted out. We had a student move from Salem Kaiser to that district with a support system, a student that was pretty high concern, had engaged in the pathway of thinking and starting to behaving as if he was going to attack a school or a small group of people. We passed that information on. They had opted out. And their response was basically, well, we'll have law enforcement look at it. And law enforcement's response, because they weren't trained in threat assessment, law enforcement has to be trained in threat assessment or they're going to go look for the crime. And if the crime's not there, they're on their way, right? But when they're trained in threat assessment, they see these little weird things that aren't necessarily a crime, and they start to engage and support. Well, they weren't trained in threat assessment, and so the response was, I don't know what you guys are worried about. We don't see a crime, so we're not going to be involved. There's no arrestable offense. The mental health folks said, well, we'll do some counseling in the community one day a week, but we don't want to own this thing. And the district said, that's what we're going to do. There's one more issue at play. It's called idol worship, and it is a type of bias. This was an athletic kid, very important to 2 different sports. So the district and the school gave the kid a pass. It is a type of bias, like implicit bias, but only it wasn't implicit. They were fully aware that they needed this kid on that team. So, he can't really be that bad, right? He can't be doing this stuff. And they got a pretty scary wake-up call as that student did become resentful, started to fantasize and think about an attack, especially some kids that had dissed him. He had some personality features where he had very thin skin and his ego was easily damaged, felt injured. And it moved along rather quickly. And then they requested for the student threat assessment team to come back in and do that one case for them. They've been back in the fold ever since and champions of the system. It was a pretty terrifying moment for them when they realize that this isn't about arrestable offenses. This isn't about it isn't about whether a kid has value to your school or not. All kids have value. It's whether or not they're thinking of trying to hurt people. And these are the simple ways we've actually find out. These are the questions, and this is what we do. We attend to the questions with interventions that are supportive so we can move that student off of the thinking and ideation. It's not a scary system. And once they learn that, then they realized it was a little bit cumbersome at times. It was most definitely worth what it cost them.
Do you think there's a way to get that message across to districts without them having to learn that lesson in real time, or and in a real world way as you're describing? I guess that for us, I think, would be important to know. And I don't know if there's certainly not anything. I mean, that's pretty powerful, but just kind of wondering if there's things that people like us can be doing to kind of convey that to districts without them having to go through something like that.
But we have the momentum of the cases. So after 25 years, a dozen really solid cases one could explain as illustration. The other route is to talk about the risk management and the liability. I always try to talk about student safety, well-being, psychological safety, and that whole piece I did on learning. Honestly, that's as important, maybe just slightly less important than making sure no one gets hurt. Because making sure kids get through school educated and capable of being good citizens is so important to commerce and everything. I know it's an abstract to a lot of people, but it's up there. So making the case that from a risk management perspective and a liability perspective, that this standardization and this kind of common language is defensible in court. It actually works. It stops these situations from getting worse. And it's pro-kid, it's pro-family, it's pro-community. The final thing that we will do on occasion when we're advising, if we are getting some resistance, is we look to court cases. Probably the most frightening to pass on is the Bakersfield Taft court case that Reed Malloy and Reed Malloy was the lawyer for the student that was harmed. And Nick or Chris Mahandi was the lawyer for the school. And they're both the best in the field. And Reed won the day. And it was an easy win because what happened in that district was I know of the school psychologist. He's a colleague's friend. And he was doing threat assessment, but he was doing it by himself. And they weren't using the actual process that they had adopted. Not just they were, if they don't have a process and they're doing the best, there is some latitude, but they weren't actually using the system. They weren't communicating together. And the terrible and painful part of this is that the administrator and I believe the school psych, maybe counselor, they share the liability. They personally are on the hook for a percentage of the liability until that's paid off. And it's a fairly substantial number. And you don't like to, you don't want to say, hey, dude, do this or you'll get your butt sued. But there is a bottom line to this, that you do the best you can with the information you have, right? And the system you have at your disposal and the resources you have. And if you have those set up in your district, you better follow them. If they're not in your district, but they're regional, that there's a standard of practice and you're not doing it, there's a liability increase just from being near a school district that's doing it right, because they're your neighbors. If you're off somewhere in the outback and no one near you is doing anything like this, then you do have a little bit of an argument to say, well, we really didn't know, we didn't have a model to use. But hey, most regions of the country have adequate, if not excellent, systems somewhere at play within a school district or a region. So I think I like the narratives the best to tell the stories and the case studies, but I always back that with, after 25 years, here's some stuff that really did happen. And this is what happened to people that didn't follow through and or worse, people that were killed or severely injured.
Yeah, it's still sort of fear-based, but we're not making this stuff up. As you said, this can really happen, and individuals can be liable.
Well, I think you just hit a nail that nobody wants to talk about on the head, Dr. Hollinger, because when you talk about law enforcement, mental health, and education, educators, like, safety is not a priority until it's too late for the most part. I
Yep.
teach a college class and a doctoral program, and that's my first statement and my last statement of the class to the educational leaders coming out of that program, because we don't want to think about it happening to us. And when the time comes, it's too late. So unless we have the courage to have the difficult conversations and really think about the reality of, like, if we're not doing preparation, one, target hardening, two, and proactive response to the pathway of violence, we're going to be on the end of it. We're not going to be, so we have to almost have that difficult, courageous conversation around, it is real, it is reality. Here's, like John said, here's the cases that this has happened, and it wasn't, everybody talks about it happened or they always think it's not going to happen to them. And it continues over and over. There's no specific characteristic of where that failed belonging person's going to come from who is able to make it through the entire pathway to violence, and they're doing the planning, and they're, hopefully you're catching it. I mean, there have been many that have been caught, but it's kind of scary to think about how many are out there. And if we leave it up to law enforcement, we leave it up to the mental health piece after the fact, we're not, the educators have such a claim in this, but we kind of just easily continue to go on and not do it.
Yeah. And
Well said.
you've actually had to do this more recently, in the concept of bringing somebody along who hadn't had anything consistent yet. And we've got great ideas on concepts as to how, and unfortunately, um, stories and of when they failed. But who are the stakeholders? Like, so when you went into this, I mean, and you've talked about you built that program there. You talked about early on even building out an SRO program, and in a school, who are your key stakeholders, Jessica, that you really have to try to um, build critical mass around so that you can get that buy-in? If it's not going to be a from on high mandate, you shall do, you must do, into the come along with me and let's do this together.
So the positive thing with Delaware is that Delaware didn't mandate it, but they did purchase the program, and they have offered the program, and we've worked with Jillian at PCG and got training consistently. So for me, when I implemented it in the district that we didn't have anything beforehand, my stakeholders were all the way from board members to, I created a board policy. We are the first district in the state of Delaware to have a board policy around behavioral threat assessments. I thought that was really important because it is such a critical liability that our board knew what we were doing and how we were going to do it. In the school specifically, obviously, for the behavioral threat assessment process. And I mean, we're talking about one, but both of them go hand in hand. The suicide risk assessment, your key players in your building is going to be your team. So your admin, your counselors, your psychologists, depending on which district, I don't know what you have in Oregon, but in Delaware, we have licensed clinical social workers in school. We have, we call them student family interventionists in Milford, people that work with us. So we get them trained. We have constables in Delaware that are school district employees who are able to have like a quasi arrest power if there is a reason. So we get them trained. Obviously, we want to collaborate and stay in not the lane of, but down the same path with our law enforcement. So we have SROs here, and we keep them up to speed. We make sure we share all the processes with them. Lots of stakeholders. And then obviously we make sure there's a message to the families that, like, hey, this is the process that we use. I like to, and it's not a farce, but I like to sell the behavioral threat assessment process to our community as a de-escalation process, because it's preventative. We're catching it when the threat's being made, and when you're going through those questions, regardless of whatever model you're using, the person being interviewed is able to really like decompress and think about, I don't really mean what I'm saying. Now, if you get to the end and they do really mean what they're saying, then obviously we're using it for the right reasons. But those are the stakeholders that are your main players. Obviously, you want your teachers to know what you're doing. You want your students to know, the families to know. So those are kind of stakeholders for a need to know, maybe a presentation really quick or a video that you can share. Hey, we use this model. And then the other ones are going to be your key players of consistent coaching, consistent conversation. In our district, we actually did open office hours every Monday for the first 3 months of the year, because we just needed to be able to talk through it as much as possible. So for 2 hours every Monday, they could pop onto a Zoom and we would talk through any questions they had, because you can make a manual, which we did here. You can make a policy. You can train for 8 hours at the beginning of the school year. But this is a very serious, very heavy process that we're asking people to do, who, when you think about school counselors, the school psychologists are trained more in it, but from the school counselor lens, the constable lens, the principal lens, even, we're asking them to make decisions based on a tree that, while it's evidence-based and research-backed, it's a scary process to go through until you really know what you're doing, right? So making sure they have the support, because if you just do the 8-hour training, 16-hour training, give them a manual and say, see you later, I can tell you from experience, and I'm sure everybody in this room can, they're not going to do it with fidelity. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Jessica, thank you, especially for hitting that student point. And John, you mentioned it before also about climate. So Jessica, you talk about prevention. John, you talk about climate. When you talk about students, though, what, John, if you would, just a little bit of what you've seen as you talk about going a little wider when it comes to that concept of students and students understanding what the process is, or anybody by all means. Yeah.
What you're wondering if how much information we give the student about the
Well, and
process?
what is that? How does that affect what's going on? So again, I've seen a lot of people try to put something in place, and it sits until parents or students start to hear about it or understand what the positives are, and then you start maybe getting a groundswell of like, wait a minute, why aren't we doing this? Why?
Yeah.
And so, again, you're not talking about your elementary kids, you're talking about your middle and your high school kids. And again, in Minnesota, we've got a long history of student activism. So students start to hear about these things, and if they don't hear the right information, then you might be in real trouble.
Yep.
But
In there.
yeah, a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, one of the early things I did, I think Jessica just mentioned that she does what I might call listening sessions with her community. Not just the support for the team members in the school. You got to do that no matter what, right? You got to have a lead or an expert in your district or a group of experts that can advise and support and coach. But the listening sessions with the community, where you're inviting parents and students in for a 45-minute symposium, we call them infomercials as well, where we highlight the program, we talk about the preventive aspects of it, that it isn't targeting, it isn't labeling. It's very much just addressing where the heartburn is, what's hurting, what's scary, how are we going to medicate that, basically with some sort of support, medicine, meaning support, inclusion, activities, mentorship, that kinds of stuff. And the community hears that information pretty easily. So do the students. Now, I said I'd been there when you mentioned that. That is because we did have a strong, and still do, activist group of students that saw this as a policing action. And it took a lot of work to show them that it wasn't, and there was some distrust that went on there. And it was also bringing their parents in at the same time. The third thing that I've done, historically, I don't do it anymore, but I used to do op-eds for the newspaper. So I would write, 800, 1,000-word op-ed that would talk about prevention or bullying, or how one moves information to the right people when they're concerned about someone's behavior, how that's not ratting out kids, because it benefits the kid you're reporting on. And I would say parents, listen to that stuff. Kids, the code of silence is still out there, especially with our male students. I think our female students tend to report more now. To say something, if you see something, we've had just a real difficult time getting especially our middle school boys to have any discussion about their friends. Now, where this changes is when they perceive that their friend's life is in jeopardy. So if it's like heavy drug use or heavy drinking and driving, they will kind of come in and say, John is he's smoking a lot of dope and drinking and driving, and they will start to come in. So part of this is that when we promote behavioral threat assessment and suicide risk assessment, is we isolate those two things in our posters and our material so that they're unique, and the message is very clear. These are devastating, damaging things that can happen, and we remove them from the old poster that used to say drugs and alcohol, suicide, and harming others. And I can't remember what the fourth one was. But what a kid's brain does is they just see that as one thing, and they think, everybody smokes dope. I'm not telling on my friend. And then they associate suicidal ideation and homicidal ideation with these other two far more benign situations comparatively to the other two. So we just tear that poster in half, and we have isolated our outreach for violence and suicide prevention um, away from the drug and alcohol zero tolerance stuff, and that's all, of course, evolved into more of a prevention and treatment model, thank goodness, rather than an expulsion model. And that worked incredibly well with the community, because our brains categorize and we block things together, and people were able to see them as different things and come forward with in situations that involved a lot less information or scary circumstances than would have been reported before. So they're starting to get that, these little things add up.
I love that. I love that splitting them. That's
Yeah. Tear it in
I,
half.
I can tell you that, yeah, my experience with even anonymous reporting has been it's necessary, but not a lot of hits over the years that
Yeah.
come through. Let's shift gears a little bit, unless you want to, and someone wants to continue. But I want to talk accountability a little bit, because unfortunately the flip side of the concept of consistency is having to have some accountability. And if you're working in a system where you may not have the accountability through authority, but what do you need from a system? Is a technology system or a paper system? What do you need when it comes to this to help have that accountability, and how does that play into consistency, Jessica?
So the idea of making sure there's clear communication around expectations and what can happen if we don't meet those expectations. That is one of the reasons why I wanted to have a board policy, because saying, hey, we're going to do this, obviously you're setting a precedent, but when you have the backing of your school board, the accountability is more real, right? So obviously having some type of, we did a 60-page manual here, which can be a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But having some kind of direction, set the expectations, and then continuously saying page 14, page 14, it kind of keeps that accountability there. It can be done in a way that is coaching and not managing, so it's coming across as supportive, but we have to make sure, if we're going to commit to something of this measure, that we are able to have a home or have that expert, like John said, in the buildings at the district, and then making sure you're available for the people when they need you in the moment. That became really clear to us, because when they're in the moment of those threat assessments, you got to answer the phone when they need you, or it's going to just, then they're going to almost have some negative experience with it and they don't want to do it again. So there's accountability all the way around, from you as the home, you as the driver, and then also them putting the work into it and being able to have those conversations when you see one building is not doing it as well as or with fidelity as other buildings. In Delaware, our data is pretty public, so that kind of is not going to fare well for you if your teams aren't doing it the way. If we have one, 4 buildings that are doing 20 or 30 assessments by this time, and your building has 3, and you have more kids, there's an issue there. So, like, just making sure that consistent coaching that really helps with the accountability piece and driving home the importance of it, the liability of it. I have been coined the compliance officer in our district because while I am here to support and make sure everything's going okay, like, I have to worry about the district's liability, the employees' liability, and our students, and what can happen if these things aren't done right.
That's real. That's totally real. And I appreciate that you talk about the concept of needing someone to support from a different level. Because again, if we're talking to a superintendent right now who's like, well, what do I need? Julie, what else would they need from us? If I'm starting this, if I'm trying to push this concept of consistency, of accountability, of bringing in all these other places and people, what other things does someone need to think about and put in place to make sure that they can be successful?
Yeah, as Jessica was talking, I was actually just thinking, your last statement, Dr. Weller, of, if one building is only doing 3 and they have a lot of students, you have another building that is doing a lot more with fewer students, there's something wrong there. And so I think one of the key components would be to make sure there's kind of that check and balance. Like, is someone keeping tabs on that? How do we know if buildings or districts are actually implementing the program as it's designed to be implemented? And of course, having an electronic system helps with that. But I think just delegating those responsibilities out so that we can make sure that we are keeping tabs. I mean, we could have all the programs in the world and have it be the simplest thing to use and the most time effective and efficient. But if we're not all actually using it, it's got one flaw. You actually have to use it in order for it to be effective. So, I think that would be something that's really key is to have someone that's ensuring that. And again, just having those checks and balances across the district.
Awesome. All right, shifting gears a little bit. We've talked about training. We've talked about all these things. I talked a little bit about research. John, there's actually brand new research out, which is exciting, and you're called out in it because of the great work you're doing. Can you give me a little bit about what that research is talking about, saying, and what the latest and greatest from that is about?
You're talking about the Eric Madvis University of Oregon paper?
Correct. The Strengthening School Violence Prevention Research Report. Yep.
There are actually going to be more papers, by the way, besides that one. So he's been working on that, or the U of Dub has been working on this since about, right around 19 when I retired. I started to build that relationship, and Courtney McCarthy, my replacement and successor, has continued. So the data is good. They're still trying to collect data from other districts. It can be difficult because of people's worry about being highlighted in something that implicates whether you are doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. But that particular paper mirrors other research on behavioral threat assessments that is preventive in design, that it doesn't target particular groups of kids. It doesn't target disenfranchised kids, and it is fairly equitable in its application. And so specifically, this research was done on the Salem-Kaiser cascade model and the protocols. And one of the outcomes that was not surprising, but delighting to me, because I didn't know they were going to study this, is they had a measure of whether or not interventions were punitive or not. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the first paper I've seen that looked at that as well. And the results are that it's not punitive. It's highly supportive of students. in a way that's preventive. So it's not enabling at all. It's supportive. It's inclusive. And a lot of the outcome studies were kids that were somewhere in that pathway, and or just super aggressive, to where they were causing, more than fat lips. They were putting kids in the hospital, and potentially even lethal aggression, not necessarily targeted, but lethal. And the outcomes were really, really positive. Not just that, but that the fidelity in which the model is implemented with the training can be pretty good. And I would use that statement to connect with one of your earlier questions on accountability. I think there's one more accountability that we have as leaders, and that is to make things user friendly for our customers. Our customers are in threat assessment, they're parents and teachers and students. That's the easy part. We just make sure our language is simple to understand. But our other customers are counselors, school psych, social workers, administrators, SROs, people on these teams. And if the protocols are not easy and user friendly, they won't use them. And when or if, God forbid, any of us end up in a court, but they say, man, read this stuff. Who knows? I don't have a vocabulary like this. I'm not a clinician. I'm a teacher. I'm a cop, whatever that is. We have to, as leaders, make this palatable. And that's why I use the word protocol with the forms that I've written. They're not assessment tools. There's a protocol, and that protocol is like a miniature version of the manual. The manual's big, but the protocol says, do this, do it this way, ask these questions, here's why, oh, this, then go there. What I love about the web-based model is you can create those portals to do that automatically, because most districts are working off of PDF forms or Google Docs, and they don't have those kinds of auto pathways. And so that helps with accountability. When you have a system that runs smoothly and that people can understand and they're trained well enough to follow the system is the expert. And so they can kind of take that breath. Again, they don't go to their middle brain and try to figure out what's going on with all this novel information. They're familiar with the visual appearance of the form, the process of the form, and that kind of accountability is important as well. So sorry, I jumped back on that previous question within the one that you asked of me. But yeah, the paper is awesome. I hope you get to read it. There'll be more, I think, coming from the U of W. We have not had the benefit of a university partner for 20 years, and now we do, and it's pretty amazing. Now, Salem Kaiser has kept data for a decade that shows all of those things that I just said. Like, we've been audited, we've talked, the advocacy groups, even the ACLU, were able to say, hey, look, here's the pie charts. No one group is getting targeted or assessed more than others, with one exception. And that is, those are students on IEPs. So students, especially with features, behavior problems, or who act their rage out, they do get referred more often. Why? It's obvious. They're saying things, right? But the way it's handled is very supportive of them. A lot, in fact, almost always, when the assessment is done, which is a fairly, like I said, easy, user-friendly assessment, it shows that student is expressively threatening, emotionally threatening, but there isn't any kind of substance or behavior, TAC-related behavior, or pathway behavior behind the threat. So it helps people understand John, who has an emotional disability, threatening and raging whenever he gets challenged on his homework. That's his coping skill. Scares the heck out of the parents walking down the hallway, but we can explain that. We've done a threat assessment. Here's what we know. That's what John does. And we're not just saying that because we're biased. We've actually looked at it. We've looked at the behavior and the circumstances. We support John in the right way, because he's not planning an attack on a school, but he does need to get control of his language. So the interventions are appropriate for my issue with yelling and screaming my threats, and replacing those with different kinds of reactions and coping skills. So it's very supportive. And I think you'll see that in the research as well. The papers that are coming out are looking at that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Always important to have that. Jessica, one from your perspective, as someone who's been in Delaware for a while in different districts, when the state came out and said, we're going to do a model, because I can tell you that that doesn't happen in every state, and I can tell you it happens in very few states, which is a challenge at times. But when you're a practitioner and now the state says, you shall do it this way, and you shall enter your data here, tell me the positives of that, because my sarcasm, leads to the fact that I know people sometimes push back against that. But tell me some of the positives you've experienced of having a state who's decided, you know what, we're going to help, and we're actually going to fund the mandate, which is always a nice thing too. But tell me a little bit about your experience from that perspective.
So the positives with that, we get to train with other districts. So we all get to kind of come together. And then when we are running into any kind of hiccups or hurdles, we can reach out to other districts that we work with in other forms to work through with this form as well, or, this topic as well. Another positive is, to John's point, it is that liability piece of like, this is what our state's paying for. This is our standard. It is evidence-based, research backed. So it kind of assists us with being able to have that standard for the districts because it is voluntary right now. So for the districts who aren't doing it, obviously that could be an issue for them. But for those who are, it is a positive piece to the puzzle that we are able to say we're doing this. And then when we share all the districts are in the same platform. When those students transfer from district to district, we're getting their assessments, we're getting the history. It's not being left behind in a counselor's drawer or in a Google Doc on a district's drive that nobody can get to because we're not really putting them in CUME folders. So there's a lot of good things that come out of it with the collaboration, the ability to cross lines with the data, and to continue the supports that are put in place from that school, and the lens of it being a standard, so we can all kind of fall back on like, hey, I was actually told how to use safety money from the state based on the state going with this. So it's kind of one of those things, they're going to push for you to do this model. It is our standard, and that's it.
That's awesome. Julia, have I missed anything? Have I missed anything we wanted to cover or talk about today?
I think we have covered the gamut of standardization, and just really appreciative of Dr. Weller and John being here to share their experiences with us today.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you both for that. And thank you all who have spent your time to listen to us today. We've really appreciated it. If you've appreciated it, please go out and do all the podcast things, like, subscribe, share, let folks know. Again, we're trying to help you be better practitioners and give you some of the insights of these wonderful folks doing this across the country. So thank you again from the BTAM Breakdown, and we'll hopefully see you next time.